refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, pursuant to House Resolution 208, I call up House Concurrent Resolution 24, expressing the sense of Congress that the report of Special Counsel Mueller should be made available to the public and to Congress, and ask for its immediate consideration in the House.
The clerk will now report the title of the concurrent resolution.
House Concurrent Resolution 24, concurrent resolution expressing the sense of Congress that the report of Special Counsel Mueller should be made available to the public and to Congress.
Pursuant to House Resolution 208, the amendments to the concurrent resolution and the preamble printed in the House Report 116-17 are agreed to, and the concurrent resolution as amended is considered read. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Collins, each will control 30 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and insert extraneous material on HCON Resolution 24.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. HCON Res 24 expresses a sense of Congress that any report Special Counsel Robert Mueller delivers to the Attorney General should be released to the public and to Congress. This concurrent resolution is important for several reasons. First, transparency is fundamental to the Special Counsel process, especially when dealing with matters of national security involving the President. In January 2017, the U.S. intelligence community unanimously reported that, quote, Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election, close quote, and that, quote, Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump, close quote. As a result of the importance of this charge and the clear conflict of interest in a matter involving the President, Robert Mueller was appointed as special counsel by the acting Attorney General, quote, in order for the American people to have full confidence in the outcome. This is why, in the only other instance involving the appointment of a special counsel under the regulations concerning the Waco tragedy, the special counsel's report was released in full by the Attorney General. Second, this resolution is critical because of the many questions and criticisms of the investigation raised by the President and his administration. It is important that Congress stand up for the principle of full transparency at a time when the President has publicly attacked the Russian investigation more than 1,100 times and counting. Among other things, the President has repeatedly referred to the investigation as a witch hunt and called it a hoax, rigged, and a scam. This resolution is also needed because high-ranking DOJ officials have indicated that they may not release information about individuals who are not indicted. Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein stated last month that, quote, if we aren't prepared to prove our case beyond a reasonable doubt in court, then we have no business making allegations against American citizens, close quote. But this normally salutary policy must not apply in the event the department adheres to its policy that it cannot indict a sitting president. To maintain that a sitting president cannot be indicted, no matter how much evidence there is, because he is a sitting president, and then to withhold evidence of wrongdoing from Congress because the president cannot be charged, is to convert the DOJ policy into the means for a cover-up. Third, releasing the Mueller report, even in its entirety, does not absolve the Department of Justice of its obligation to provide Congress with the underlying evidence uncovered by the special counsel. This expectation is well grounded in precedent set by the Department just in the last Congress in connection with 3 Republican-led investigations into Hillary Clinton's emails, the dismissal of former acting FBI Director McCabe, and allegations of bias concerning the Russia investigation. With respect to the investigation involving Secretary Clinton's emails, this included the Department of Justice releasing to Congress more than 880,000 pages of documents regarding the FBI's decision-making, identifying to Congress the names of career officials involved in the charging decision, identifying to Congress specific court cases relied on in the charging decision, and making numerous DOJ and FBI personnel available to Congress for transcribed interviews. With respect to the dismissal of former acting Director McCabe, This included releasing to Congress all documents relied on by the Office of Professional Responsibility in making its decision. And with respect to claims of bias in the Russia investigation, this included not only releasing to the public an otherwise classified foreign intelligence application, but also releasing to Congress, 1, all underlying documents and communications involving the FISA application, 2, 4 memos detailing former FBI directors' communications with the President, 3, materials pertaining to classified briefings involving the Trump and Clinton presidential campaigns, and 4, making even more DOJ and FBI officials available for a total of 21 transcribed interviews and hearings. These precedents make clear the obligation of the Department of Justice to release all the evidence with respect to the Russia investigation. A vote for this resolution will send a clear signal to both the American people and to the Department of Justice that Congress believes transparency is a fundamental principle necessary to ensure that government remains accountable to the public. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me in supporting this common sense resolution. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves his time. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I appreciate the gentleman in this time this morning. I intend to support this resolution, but in the matter of time and coming through this week, and might as well have 30 minutes, so we'll talk about a resolution. It's a restatement of the law and the regulation, I'm sorry. But I want to provide some background on the Special Counsel's regulations. Special Counsel Mueller is operating under a different regulatory framework from the independent counsel statute that gave us the Starr report. The Clinton administration's Justice Department, which was led by Attorney General Janet Reno, Deputy Attorney General Eric Holder, and Neil Katyal, drafted the Special Counsel regulations in effect today. They established a regulatory framework that gives the Attorney General flexibility. Attorney General Barr has a few options when he receives the information from Mr. Mueller. He could give Congress the complete report, a summary, or he could simply tell Congress that the Mueller investigation has concluded. The Clinton administration regulations do not require a full report to Congress. However, during his confirmation, Attorney General Barr said he wants to be transparent with Congress and the public, consistent with the rules and the law. We have no reason to think Attorney General Barr would back away from those statements he has made before the Senate Judiciary Committee. And Mr. Speaker, I believe he is truthful and will be truthful to his word to make as much possible as he possibly can. The American people should not expect another Starr report. The Clinton Justice Department made sure another president would not have salacious stories aired before the American people. Janet Reno herself testified before Congress in 1999 that it was a bad idea for independent counsels to publish final reports. Many members of the Democratic majority in Congress today voted against the public release of materials related to the Starr report. And Mr. Speaker, I would ask unanimous consent to insert into the record a narrative related to a roll call vote 425 from the 105th Congress.
Without objection.
Thank you. For the record, I would note that the following Democratic members voted against the release of the Starr materials: Speaker Pelosi, Majority Whip Clyburn, Chairman Nadler, Chairman Cummings, Chairman Engel, Chairman Waters, Ms. Jackson Lee, Mr. Markey, Chair Lofgren, and Chairman Neal, among others. It is amazing that we have now changed our perspective on that, but in light of that with a Republican in the White House. Again, this resolution simply basically restates the regulations that are currently in place that were written under the Clinton Department of Justice. It is going to come forward. The new Attorney General has said he wants to make as much possible as he can legally to come to the American people. I believe in transparency. I believe that there are many other things we could be working on, but I'm happy to support a regulation that is actually just a restatement. This resolution is a restatement of the regulatory burden already placed upon the Attorney General. And with that, I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the gentlewoman from California, the distinguished chairwoman of the Financial Services Committee, Ms. Waters.
Gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chairman Nadler. Mr. Speaker, I strongly support H-Con Res 24, which expresses the sense of Congress that the report of Special Counsel Robert Mueller should be available to the public and to Congress. Special Counsel Counsel Mueller has been appointed to ensure a full and thorough investigation of the Russian government's efforts to interfere in the 2016 presidential election and to examine any links and/or coordination between the Russian government and individuals associated with the campaign of President Donald Trump. He has also been appointed with the authority to investigate and prosecute federal crimes committed in the course of and with the intent to interfere with the investigation, including perjury, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence, and intimidation of witnesses. The gravity and magnitude of this investigation, given that it goes straight to the heart of our democracy and involves the President of the United States, requires the public release of the special counsel's findings. This is an investigation that affects each and every American, whether it implicates or exonerates the president, and therefore it must be brought to light so that the American people can see for themselves the findings and determinations made by an objective, impartial investigator who has a reputation for integrity. In addition, the report will provide valuable insight and information for the important investigations being undertaken in the House, including the investigation being conducted by the Committee on Financial Services on money laundering and the President's financing. Special Counsel Mueller has been appropriately deliberate and discreet in conducting this investigation. It is clear from the manner in which the Special Counsel has approached this investigation that he has taken it seriously and has not conducted what President Trump refers to as a witch hunt. So far, the Special Counsel's investigation has resulted in 199 criminal charges, 37 indictments or guilty pleas, and 5 prison sentences. Whatever his prosecutorial decisions may be going forward, it is in the public's interest to be given full transparency into those decisions and the explanations behind them. I thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California, the distinguished chair of the Intelligence Committee, Mr. Schiff.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from New York for yielding and for his sponsorship of this important legislation. I rise in strong support. Special Counsel Robert Mueller was appointed in May 2017 to oversee the ongoing criminal and counterintelligence investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 election. And over the nearly 2 years since his appointment, the Special Counsel has indicted 34 individuals and 3 companies and secured guilty pleas or convictions from 8 individuals. We do not know when the Special Counsel will complete his work, but there are indications that it could occur in the near future. Notwithstanding the overwhelming public interest in the Special Counsel's report and findings, I am deeply concerned that Attorney General Barr may attempt to withhold Mueller's full report from the public and the underlying evidence from Congress, and could instead seek to provide only a Cliff Notes version of the report to Congress. As this resolution makes clear, Congress will not accept any attempt by Mr. Barr or the President to bury the report and the findings of the Special Counsel. Withholding this information would be untenable in light of the intense public interest and need for transparency, but particularly so when the Department has provided voluminous production to Congress at the demand of the previous majority, including sensitive FISA materials and other classified and law enforcement sensitive materials related to the Mueller investigation and the Clinton email investigation. Last year, I repeatedly warned Department leadership that in providing these materials to Congress, they were establishing a precedent, and one that they would have to live with in the future. They did so anyway, and while anonymous sources at the Department have attempted to publicly blame James Comey for the provision of this information, in fact, the Department has turned over more than 880,000 pages of documents from the Clinton email investigation to Congress, all of them pursuant to congressional subpoenas issued after James Comey was fired. And they have produced highly sensitive records, including FISA materials, directly related to ongoing investigations at the core of the Special Counsel's charter. To be sure, something far more serious than precedent is at stake. Disclosure is uniquely imperative here because the Special Counsel reportedly is investigating whether the President himself engaged in misconduct. If the Special Counsel has indeed uncovered evidence of serious wrongdoing on the President's part, then that evidence must be furnished to Congress and ultimately to the American people. Withholding the full report or underlying evidence would only heighten concerns over a cover-up or a pernicious or partisan double standard. The special counsel's regulations were written above all to ensure public confidence in the fair and impartial administration of justice. That charge would be entirely vitiated by an attempt to cover up or conceal special counsel Mueller's findings and report, whatever they may be and whenever they are finalized. I urge members of both parties to join me in supporting this resolution and to make clear that anything less than full transparency is unacceptable. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the President. At this time, the gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield a minute and a half to the gentleman from California, member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Liu.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Nadler, for your leadership. I rise in support of this resolution requesting that Special Counsel Mueller's report be made available to the public. There are 3 reasons why this must happen. First, the taxpayers paid for this report. The American people funded this investigation. They have a right to see the contents of the report of their investigation. Second, internal bureaucratic Department of Justice policies do not apply to Congress, especially on matters of national importance. And third, if we don't get this report, it could amount to a cover-up. The United States Constitution does not say that a sitting president cannot be indicted. There is nothing in the Constitution that would prevent that. Unfortunately, the Department of Justice has taken the policy position that they are not going to indict a sitting president, which means the only institution that can hold the president accountable is Congress. If we do not get this information, we cannot effectively do our jobs, we cannot hold the president accountable, and it is something that the American public want to see. Over 87% of respondents in a recent poll say that this report should be made available to Congress and to the American public. And if the Department of Justice does not do this, we all need to ask, what are they trying to hide? And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Colorado, member of the Judiciary Committee, Mr. Neguse.
The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Neguse, is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the chairman for his leadership and for introducing this incredibly important resolution. The investigation currently underway by Special Counsel Robert Mueller is incredibly important. An open investigation into incredibly serious allegations, potential obstruction of justice, corruption, and possible links of coordination between Donald Trump's presidential campaign and the Russian government. Efforts to meddle in our democratic process and mislead and manipulate American voters. The allegations at the center of this investigation, as I said, are serious, they are credible, and they are unprecedented. And with 37 indictments and counting, it is of paramount importance that the special counsel's report and the underlying evidence be made public for the sake of transparency and trust in our government. As a nation, as a Congress, as a republic, we need to know all of the facts about this investigation and what unfolded between players in the president's campaign and Russia in 2016. We must protect and respect the work of Special Counsel Mueller, and his report must be released in full for the Congress and for the American people to see. And so again, I thank the chairman for introducing this resolution. I encourage my colleagues to support it, and I yield back.
Back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentleman from Georgia continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished chairman of the Subcommittee on Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen, is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we're discussing is one of the most important documents that will ever be produced and given potentially to Congress for the American people in our modern history. A question of whether or not this administration was involved with the Russian government, our #1 foreign enemy, in influencing the outcome of our presidential election, something tantamount to treason. The report needs to be made public because the American people have a right to know. The American people, as Ronald Reagan, to paraphrase, said, I paid for this microphone. The American people paid for this report. They paid for the special counsel. They deserve to see the fruits of his work, and whether or not, as Richard Nixon said, their president is a crook. They need to know that. Unfortunately, as I sit here listening to this discussion, I feel like I'm thrown back into a time in the 1970s. I think it was 1977, somewhere about there, in Kinshasa, Zaire, not in the Washington, D.C. Capitol. It's the Muhammad Ali-George Foreman fight. And the other side, the Republicans, are playing the role of Muhammad Ali. Not the float like a butterfly, sting like a bee Muhammad Ali, but the rope-a-dope. Sit back, take the punches, let them swing, let them hit you, because they know that eventually they'll wear themselves out, and they know the outcome, because the fix is in. There's a reason why the Attorney General was picked by this president, and we'll soon find out. But we need to pass this resolution and show the American people that Congress is on the side of transparency and of releasing this report and letting the American public who paid for this report know the results of it and know what needs to happen to protect our democracy and the rule of law. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back, and members are again reminded that they should refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. The gentleman from Georgia.
Personalities against the sitting Attorney General. I mean, you're saying that he was appointed for a reason? Mr. Speaker, in a parliamentary inquiry.
The gentleman would now state his parliamentary inquiry.
Is it not also directed at the House to not also impugn the integrity and the character of a sitting cabinet member?
At this time, the gentleman from Georgia is advised that the chair is not in a position to advise on that parliamentary inquiry.
I wouldn't want to do it either, Mr. Speaker, because
I will not
it's true.
be in a position to offer an advisory opinion.
Offer?
Yeah.
Can you offer? You said you were able to offer an advisory opinion.
Reminded not to engage in personalities against the president.
The specific point that I made was that members are advised not to engage in specific allegations against the president.
Okay, continuing my parliamentary inquiry, I made a parliamentary inquiry concerning a cabinet member, not the president. I understand your advisory opinion against the president. I would fully agree with it. I'm asking about a member of the cabinet.
The rule against personalities does not apply to the Attorney General.
You are advised that there is no rule that prohibits any comments against a sitting cabinet member, only the president.
Wow.
Those are the rules of the House. The gentleman is advised.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for enlightening us on that. It's okay basically to impugn the integrity of a sitting member of the cabinet. I guess we just learned something new today. That's encouraging. As far as members of the House, I get it's not in the rules, but it also shouldn't be a part of this debate. This is a simple resolution. It simply restates the regulation. Don't make it any more, any less than what it is. That's why we're here. We're going to approve this. We're going to vote for it. But let's just not make it any more than what it is, and let's continue on so we can get to a vote. Everybody can go home, and maybe we'll come back and actually vote on legislation that actually matters without a reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Washington, member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jayapal.
The gentlelady from the state of Washington is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of HCON Resolution 24 to express the sense of Congress that Special Counsel Mueller's report be made available to the American people and to Congress. We cannot impugn the integrity of the American people by keeping this report silenced. For nearly 2 years, Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his team have investigated serious and credible allegations about obstruction of justice and collusion at the highest levels of our government. And to date, Mr. Speaker, the investigation has led to the public indictment of 3 companies and 34 individuals, including the indictment of President Trump's former campaign manager, personal lawyer, 7 guilty pleas, and 1 conviction following a jury trial. The allegations range from election interference to lying to the FBI to conspiracy to defraud the United States. Now, Mr. Speaker, this should not be a Republican or Democratic issue. I hope that my colleagues on the other side will understand that there should be nothing to hide from the American people about this investigation, a special counsel's investigation into whether there was interference in our elections. And if my Republican colleagues have nothing to fear of this report, if they are willing to stand up for the Constitution, if they are willing to stand up for the American people and put that Constitution over party, over any individual, including the one that sits in the White House, then they too will join us in voting unanimously for this resolution. And it's a big deal. For the American people to maintain trust in our democracy and in our government, they have to know the results of the special counsel's report. This is, again, an American issue. It's about doing our constitutional duty to protect our democracy. And I look forward, Mr. Speaker, to having a unanimous vote on this resolution, passing it through and making it clear that we have nothing to hide. It is our duty to the American people. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad, I don't know, maybe I need to make my, getting the talking points for my other side clear. I agreed on Monday that I was voting for this. We're not opposing this because it's simply a restatement of the regulation. I know that it's fashionable to think that we're not. So again, I'm sorry, I could have got those, maybe talking points out, made it clear at rules that I was voting for this, and so we could have saved some extra time on some of the discussion here. But again, we'll continue to go through this, and at this point, I'll continue to reserve. I appreciate it.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 3 minutes to the sponsor of legislation to ensure that the work of the special counsel is not suppressed, and who offered valuable assistance on today's resolution, Mr. Doggett of Texas.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Doggett, is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your work on this. The relentless, baseless attacks on an American patriot, Robert Mueller, and his team have moved us ever so closer to a constitutional crisis. Just as we cannot yield to Trump's attempt to discredit this distinguished team of legal experts, neither can we let them bury the results of this taxpayer-paid investigation. Having nothing to fear means having nothing to hide. Those who seek to hide this report obviously do not believe that the truth will set them free. Rather, as it has for so many of Mr. Trump's sleazy cohorts, they fear that the truth will lock them up. So many lies, so much daily deceit, already so much evidence of collusion and obstruction, and from the organization's own former lawyer, evidence of an apparent criminal enterprise that bears the name of the Trump Organization. If it is a witch hunt, Mr. President, it has more witches than a Mar-a-Lago Halloween party. And your witch's brew seems to have cast a spell over many members of this Congress who find themselves locked in continuing silence or wishy-washy efforts to ignore and bolster your floundering presidency. Today's resolution says to President Trump, who has shown such consistent disregard for the rule of law, you cannot seize in secret evidence of conduct that others need to see. Let the taxpayers see the results of the investigation of the wrongdoing which their dollars have rightly funded. Our congressional duty is to enforce the borders, to be border patrol people, to see that this president who was willing to cross every line, every constitutional boundary, to see that he is contained within the borders of the Constitution. For the rule of law to stand, the administration cannot be allowed to sit on the special counsel's report. I urge adoption of the resolution and yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left, please?
The gentleman is advised that you have 11 minutes remaining. The gentleman from Georgia has 26.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you, Mr.
The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Himes.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from New York, and thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I also thank the ranking member. I very much appreciate his comments that he will support this bill. I will just observe as a member of the Intelligence Committee that we have seen our politics twisted into almost unrecognizable form by the unprecedented attacks of the President on the Department of Justice, on the FBI, on the investigation as a whole. This report must see the light of day and must be available to the American public for a catharsis that will allow us to start with the facts, to understand what happened, and to rebuild the faith that the American people did and should have in the Department of Justice, in the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and in the government in general. So I rise in strong support of Congress in strong bipartisan fashion passing this bill so that the American people will understand that the truth will be out there and it will help fix our politics. With that, I yield back and thank the gentleman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from Texas, a member of the Judiciary Committee, Ms. Jackson Lee.
The gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the chairman very much, and I too add my appreciation, Mr. Collins, to your eagerness to adhere to what I think is an appropriate policy that reasserts the Article I authority, if you will, of the Congress. And I think it is important for my colleagues to recognize that Americans are wondering. They are wondering. They have heard over and over again of Russian collusion. They have heard the factual affirmation that the Russians did interfere with the 2016 election and tried to interfere with the 2018 election. And therefore, it's important for them in their concern to be informed. They are taxpayers. We say this all the time. The resources that Mr. Mueller's used are their dollars. And it is important to note that through this investigation, the National Security Advisor and former Foreign Policy and many others have gone to court because of Mr. Mueller. It is indeed important to know that we have learned much because of his report, but we have not learned all. And we must overcome Attorney General Barr's hesitation because the American people have made the point. The point is that 68% of them say that they would like to see this report. Now, we know that it has been bandied around that we cannot indict a president. This is not about indicting a president. But assuming an arguendo that this regulation is correct, that someone thinks that that is constant law, and the president cannot be subjected to criminal process, and therefore cannot and should not be indicted, it is a logical fallacy to say that because he cannot be indicted by virtue of his office and because it is the Justice Department regulation not to reveal information about unindicted parties and individuals. The Justice Department cannot reveal any information of potential wrongdoing by the president and not reveal any information to the body that possesses the constitutional responsibility for holding this president accountable. So let us follow good policy, even the words of Attorney General Barr that recognizes that the DOJ's purpose is to release investigations in the public interest. This is in the public interest, and so I would suggest to all that we do this in a bipartisan way to give to the American people what they deserve and what they want. I yield back.
The lady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Could I inquire of my chairman if he has any more speakers? Do you have any more speakers, Mr. Chairman?
I have at least 2 more speakers.
Outstanding. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York shall proceed.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Capter.
Gentlelady from Ohio is recognized for 1 minute.
I'd like to thank Chairman Nadler for yielding, and my call today is for full transparency with a clear focus on the sinister motives of Russia's corrupt leaders. Their interference in our 2016 elections has created confusion, anger, bewilderment, and division, exactly what Russia wanted. Today's resolution calls for the Department of Justice to make Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report, along with any findings available to the public to the maximum extent permitted by law, and to provide the report and its findings in entirety to the Congress of the United States. So whether you view Special Counsel Mueller as a patriot, conducting a nonpartisan investigation into a foreign power's possible influence in our elections, or as a witch hunt, a full accounting and public release of the findings is needed to heal our political differences. This is not about embarrassing President Trump. This is about closure and full disclosure. If there was no collusion, as the President has emphasized, then he should want complete transparency. The American people deserve no less. I yield back any remaining time to our distinguished chairman, Mr. Nadler.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Georgia continues to reserve. The gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Maryland, the distinguished Majority Leader, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland, the Majority Leader, is recognized.
Yes, unanimous consent to advise and stand.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, last week the House passed H.R. 1, major legislation to strengthen voter access, address the corrosive influence of dark money in politics, institute national redistricting reform, and hold public officials accountable to higher standards of ethics and transparency. Taking the next step, this week is Sunshine Week on the House floor. The House has already passed several pieces of legislation this week to modernize government and increase transparency, accountability, and good governance. They include measures aimed at shining a light onto Russia's malign activities around the world and its suppression of democracy within its own borders. The resolution we now have before us expresses the sense of Congress that the American people ought to have transparency when it comes to the investigation into Russia's interference in our elections and efforts to undermine our democracy. It says that the special counsel's report ought to be made public to the fullest extent of the law, and that Congress should see all of it. Nearly 9 in 10 Americans believe the special counsel's report should be made public. And we've heard that from Republicans in the Congress as well. I hope this will be a bipartisan vote to tell the American people you have the right to and ought to know the results of this report. One of my Republican colleagues, Representative Mike Turner from Ohio, said in February, the report has to be made public. And Susan Collins of Maine said, and I quote, "The American people deserve to know what the findings are of Mr. Mueller. I believe the report should be released," said Senator Collins. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to join me, Mr. Nadler, Republicans and Democrats, on supporting this resolution and in calling for transparency. Let's come together in a bipartisan vote to make it clear that the American people deserve to know the full extent of what Russia has done in the objective of subverting and undermining our democratic institutions. I thank the Chair for bringing this resolution to the floor. I urge all of us to support it. Let's send a unanimous message to the Russians and to any other country or entity that would try to subvert our democratic elections that will not be tolerated. And I yield back the balance of my time.
The Majority Leader yields back. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, could you enlighten me on how much time I have and how much the majority has?
The gentleman from Georgia has 26½ minutes remaining. Gentleman from New York has 6 minutes remaining.
I'll reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
We are prepared to close if the minority is prepared to close first.
I was preparing to close, but I have been told that I have someone who is wanting to come to the floor. And out of abundance of caution, so that I can make sure that they have the ability to come down here and speak what they may on this, I will speak for a few minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as I have said today, and it's interesting to me, I think this is the funny part of this, because so many times we come up here and we retreat to our partisan sides and we say, I'm going to be yes, you're going to be a no. And the sad part about it is, with Mr. Cohen and my colleague from Tennessee, I said yes on Monday night. I said yes to the resolution on Monday night. But yet it seems like somehow through the process, well, we need everybody to come together. We've talked about this. It's nothing but a restatement of the regulation. Attorney General Barr will follow the regulation. He has said so. He has been in committee and during his time of confirmation, he has said so. I think what we need to understand here, and maybe we also need to throw this out here, and maybe this is something, because I've heard a lot of my colleagues across the aisle talk about what they believe should be in this report. Well, maybe I have a problem and maybe a news flash to give them. What happens when it comes back and says none of this was true? The president did not do anything wrong. Then the meltdown will occur. I heard probably earlier, just one of my colleagues actually on the other side stated that the elections has thrown chaos into the system. No, the reason the election is thrown chaos is because President Trump won and the Democratic candidate didn't know where Wisconsin was. Y'all remedied that this time, though. The Democratic candidate for president will actually have been to Wisconsin by the election day next time. There's other reasons to do this. As we go forward, transparency is good. Is he here? As we go forward, my hope would be on this issue, let's let the report be given to the Attorney General. Let's let the Attorney General do the regulation and follow the regulation and give as much as he has said in his confirmation hearing that he wants to be transparent. He wants to be a part. He wants this to come out because he understands the questions, the turmoil that this has caused. So I have nothing to believe that this would not be true. There's nothing been presented here today to think that it wouldn't be true. That's what makes this resolution even more amazing to me. Nothing has been presented that Mr. Barr would not do what the regulations say. Now, there may be more wanted and everything else, but let's talk about what actually the resolution says, and that's what it says. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, contrary to what the gentleman from Georgia implied a few minutes ago, that we shouldn't be wasting our time on this because it only restates what the regulations require, and the Judiciary Committee ought to be spending its time more productively. I simply want to say first that the Democratic House majority and the Judiciary Committee are not focused on the President to the exclusion of our legislative priorities. In the 2 months since we organized, the Judiciary Committee has passed H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2019 through the House, has passed H.R. 1112, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2019 through the House, H.R. 1585, the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act of 2019 passed through the committee. We have passed H.R. 1, the For the People Act of 2019 through the House. We have passed, the Judiciary Committee has also held a hearing to begin the process of reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act and held a hearing to examine the state of competition in the healthcare industry, as well as the Sprint T-Mobile merger. We have introduced H.R. 5, the Equality Act, H.R. 1327, the Never Forget the Heroes Permanent Authorization of the September 11th Victims Compensation Fund Act, and the American Dream and Promise Act of 2019, the so-called Dreamers Bill. These are some of the things we've been doing besides looking into the possible misconduct by the President. In closing, I would like to introduce the following items into the record. 1, the U.S. intelligence community report concluding that Vladimir Putin ordered a misinformation campaign directed against the 2016 presidential election and displayed a clear preference for then-candidate Donald Trump. 2, a February 22, 2019 letter to the Attorney General from 6 House committee chairs expressing the expectation that the Mueller report will be made public and that the Department will make the underlying investigative materials available to committees upon request. 3, the introduction to final report to the Deputy Attorney General concerning the 1993 confrontation at the Mount Carmel complex. And 4, the Department of Justice commentary interpreting the Special Counsel regulations. I'd also like to say, Mr. Speaker, that one reason for this resolution, given the fact that Mr. Barr, the Attorney General, has in fact said that he would want to release as much as possible, and we appreciate that statement, but he and Mr. Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, have both said, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, have both cited the Department policy not to comment on the conduct of someone not indicted. And that leads us to expect that a misapplication of the normal Department policy to a sitting president of not commenting on someone who's not indicted, the application of that normally good policy to a sitting president who the department believes cannot be indicted because he's a sitting president would, in fact, greatly limit the ability of the department or the willingness of the department to release information in the report to the Congress and to the public. And one of the reasons for this resolution is that we want to say, no, you cannot use that normally salutary policy to convert the department's policy of never indicting a sitting president into a cover-up that you can't comment or give to the Congress information about that. If you can't indict a sitting president and you can't give the information to Congress, then you are holding the president above the law and you are frustrating Congress's ability to do its job of holding an administration accountable. I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Hurd.
Now it's for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, and to the chairman, thank you for the indulgence. And I rise in support of this resolution because I want the whole truth and nothing but the truth to come to light in this matter. I want to know what Vladimir Putin did to our electoral process. I want to know the failures of the Obama administration in reacting to this attack in real time. I want any Americans complicit to face severe consequences, and I want the American people to know as much as they can and see as much as they can. As a member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, I support the efforts in the request for all information pertaining to this investigation to be open to the public. That includes all witness lists, every interview transcript, and every document provided. The taxpayers paid millions for this information, and they should get to see all of it and not just the assessment of one person. This resolution should have been broader, it should have been deeper, and it should have covered everything dealing with the investigation, but it's a step in the right direction. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle accept the calls for all the information to be made public, because full transparency is the only way to prevent future speculation. Full transparency is the only way to prevent future innuendo. I urge a yes vote, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York has 1 minute remaining. You're recognized.
I will yield to the gentleman from Georgia 15 seconds.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chairman, I just want to say thank you. I appreciate Mr. Hurd. He was on his way over here. I did my best song and dance. It didn't last long enough. I'm from the South. I'm Baptist. I can't dance that well. So we got that. So I appreciate you giving him that moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I yield myself the balance of the time.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Speaker, for all the reasons stated by all the people who spoke in favor of this resolution, myself and everyone else, I urge the adoption of the resolution. I urge everyone to vote for it. And it's a very important resolution to maintain the rule of law in this country, and I yield back the balance of my time.
All time for debate has expired. Pursuant to House Resolution 208, the previous question is ordered on the concurrent resolution and preamble as amended. The question is on adoption of the concurrent resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The concurrent resolution is agreed to.
Mr. Speaker.
The gentleman from New York.
Yes, for a recorded vote.
Does the gentleman ask for the yeas and nays?
I do.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will please rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, this 15-minute vote on adoption of the concurrent resolution will be followed by a 5-minute vote on agreeing to the Speaker's approval of the journal if ordered. This is a 15-minute vote.
A busy day on Capitol Hill today as the House is debating this non